We are now ready for our second session on economics, growth, energy, and sanctions. May I now request the distinguished speakers for the session on economics, growth, energy, and sanctions to please come on stage. The session chair, Mr. Nitin Pai, is the co-founder and director, Takshashila Institution. I would now like to welcome the panelists for this session. Dr. Rakesh Mohan is the President, Center for Social and Economic Progress, formerly Brookings, India. We will have a joint presentation by Dr. Patnaik, Chief Economist, Aditya Birla Group, and Professor Ajay Shah, Senior Research Fellow and co-founder, XKDR Forum. Over to you, Mr. Nitin Pai.
Good morning to everyone. We have an offset of 20 minutes from the session time, and what I'll try and do is take this up to 1:15, which will intrude on your lunch by 15 minutes. But I think the panelists are such that I think the opportunity cost of those 15 minutes at lunchtime will be more than compensated by the discussion which you'll have here in the room. But I promise you 1:15, lunch at 1:15. Before I start, so what I'll do is I'll sacrifice what I have to say. I'll just take no more than 3 minutes. I think because the panelists here are much more interesting people in terms of their insights. I'll just make very brief comments to contextualize this. There's a very, the question is why this session today? Why this session on geoeconomics in this session today? There's a very strong old book written by Paul Kennedy called The Rising and the Fall of Great Powers. It's very, very thick, 1,000 pages, a lot of data. But if I were to summarize it in one phrase, it basically goes like this. Great powers rise because of economic growth, and they fall because of strategic overreach. So economic growth is a very important component of geopolitics. Geoeconomics is an important part of geopolitics. Ajay also talks about economic power being the basis of national power. So this is important. So that's why we have this panel today. As a lead up to the panel, I'll just make 4 relevant, related but disconnected points. The first one is I've been fortunate to be a member of a India-Russia track 1.5 conversation, thanks to Ambassador Rakesh for the past few years. And I've just made one point consistently in all these sessions, which is that the fundamental challenge in India-Russia relations is that they are very concentrated and state intermediated. And this creates an imbalance. We tend to buy very few things, defense, energy, and probably a few other things from Russians. And there's nothing else. Right? It's heavily concentrated, and most of this trade happens through a Delhi-Moscow state-to-state or state-linked kind of relationship, whether it's oil, whether it's defense. So it's very lopsided. You compare that with our relationship with China, with whom we have big problems. It's $125 billion, and it's intermediated through the international trading system. It's a multilateral relationship with which we deal with China. So despite having problems with China, our trade with China is growing. So we lack, the India-Russia relationship is a Delhi-Moscow relationship. It's not an India-Russia relationship. So I used to joke that, we don't have a Skolko-Bangalore partnership. How many Russians do you see on the streets of Bangalore? Very few. How many Chinese do you see on the streets of Bangalore? Quite a few. At least until Doklam and others happened, quite a few. Right? So that is one issue there which I think we have to grapple square on. The second is that when the outbreak, when the war in Ukraine broke out, they tended to be 2 distinct kinds of responses in the Indian system. I'm not talking about people in social media and media who which is a very low-cost way of intervention, but people who have significant stakes in this game. So the state-related people, which whether you've been in the armed forces, in the foreign policy, whether in government, tend to have a pro-Russian, tilting towards Russia, sympathetic towards Russia. Let me not call it pro-Russia, but it's sympathetic towards Russia. But the market-related people, trade, business, economics, technology, were extremely unsympathetic towards the Russian case and very pro-Ukraine and more importantly pro-West. So that's the second point. It's a related thing. Third is, I had a conversation with a business leader who happens to have pretty large investments in Pune, among other places. And he told me that he went to many conversations in the last few months, and he told me, these are his words. He says, we get a lot of geopolitical gyan, but what should we do? Nobody is telling us what we should do as a company. We don't have sectoral analysis. What does it mean for pharmaceuticals? What it means for space? What does it mean for telecom? These are differential impacts. Nobody's done sectoral analysis. So his point was that nobody tells us what to do, and we are fending for ourselves and making decisions as we go along. And final point in response to Raja Mohan, when he said, we're doing fairly well after 6 months. I'm an electrical engineer. I always look at it in terms of second order and higher order systems. The fluctuations and oscillations can, oscillate over a long period of time. You might, currently it's on an upswing, you feel that everything's all right, but then there's a downswing which will come and will go back, and it takes some time to stabilize. So it's too early to tell how well we've done and how good our policy towards this conflict is. And I think that's the importance of this session. That the game is not over. India's response towards the Ukraine crisis is not over. You've not seen the end of everything that we have to do or we can do. So because it's a game in progress, the conversation that we have today is important because it feeds into India's response. If there is a need for a corrective action, negative feedback, probably we should be doing it. If there's need for positive reinforcement, we should be doing it. So in that spirit, let me open this conversation to Professor Raja Mohan. I'm confused with the RMs here. Professor Rakesh Mohan, who will take us through a presentation for the first 20 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nitin. Let me start by this thing. First, we have two things in common. One, that you said that it's really economic growth that will be the most important factor in what we do in the future. And secondly, my first degree was also in electrical engineering. Not that I remember anything of it. It's customary to thank the sponsors, that is Rakesh, my friends, Ramesh Mashelkar and Vijay Kelkar. But I'll start by saying that I would blame them for bringing me here rather than thanking them. Because unlike the... How do I... That's better, I think I can now see it. Blame them because unlike the last panel, each of whom were real experts on this issue of Russia-Ukraine, I've only been to Russia once, to Moscow for 2.5 days for the G20 back in 2012. Of course, I've never been to Ukraine. And like most economists, we are very Western-oriented because that's where we studied and so on. And that's one of the points that I think Nitin I can just expand on. That if you had heard the last session, you would have thought we were we've been best friends forever, BFFs with Russia, right? But how many Indians have been to Russia? How many Indians have studied in Russia? What kind of people-to-people contacts do we have? So there's a real, I think that's a very important point, Nitin, that you made. That's a very different kind of relationship between India and the West and India and Russia. Obviously on the geopolitical, geostrategic defense side, it's much closer than with the West, but not otherwise. In fact, my friends used to say earlier in the 80s and 90s that all the politicians, bureaucrats who espoused the cause of Russia or Soviet Union at that time, how many of them are sending their sons or daughters to Russia to study? So let me just start with that. The first few slides are actually kind of unnecessary given what you've heard. So next, this is an important slide that very important to see that, say, from around 2008, after the great financial crisis, usually actually call it the North Atlantic financial crisis, not the global economic financial crisis, because it's only the North Atlantic that was affected. But be that as it may. But the important point in the slide is that after pretty rapid growth in the early 2000s for Russia, and a blip in 2010-11, the Russian economy has been pretty stagnant. This is the actual, in absolute numbers, absolute US current dollars, not growth rates. So it's been pretty stagnant for the last 10 years or thereabouts, maybe a little less. And of course, Ukraine has been even more stagnant for the whole period. So I think this is something to keep in mind as we look at what's been happening. That, again, as I said, I really don't know much about what's been happening in Russia inside, but I would imagine that with this kind of stagnation in the last number of years, there must be internal pressures to do something else to keep the people either diverted or whatever, because it's very, I presume it's quite serious to have this kind of stagnation, economic stagnation, which goes back again to Nitin, what you said on the importance of economic strength. Next. In terms of what's happening now after the war, or not after the war, but during the war, this is a combination, of course, of the COVID crisis the last couple of years and the impact on the global economy and into every economy because of COVID, lockdowns and so on. But the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis is reflected in the downward projections that the IMF and World Bank are doing in terms of global economic growth. So whereas the earlier projected growth going down in any case, but the April forecast the forecast now is 0.4% lower than the April forecast and 1.2% lower than the January forecast. This is global economic growth. The inflation had in fact started going up even before the crisis, before the invasion. Mainly because of excessive fiscal expansion in the West and monetary expansion in the West, so that is going up in any case. Here I think I would say in terms of our own economic, fiscal and monetary policy, that even though I was critical in 2020 when we did not expand the fisc to cope with the COVID crisis, now I do feel that we were smarter than most of the developed economy, that we didn't expand the fisc as much as they did. Although of course people would have suffered somewhat more, but global inflation has gone up mainly because of the fiscal and monetary expansions because of COVID. But now it has got further, the inflation going up further because of the dislocations in the supply chain, particularly food and energy. So the average inflation in 22 anticipated for advanced economy is about 6.6%, and higher in emerging markets, though among the emerging markets we are lower than most of the others. And again, these have been revised upwards respectively. Remember that US inflation is just about 9%, which is the highest in 40 years. And this could be game-changing, possibly in terms of politics within the US. And there is as yet not much sign of going down. It will probably go down, but not in a hurry. It would mean, for it to go down, there will have to be much stronger monetary contraction compared to now. So that again itself will induce possibly a recession in the United States. They've already had 2 quarters of negative growth in the United States. So as I said, that's partly a consequence of what was happening before, but it's been magnified by the war. As I said, the disinflation monetary policy will indeed have an impact. Next. Next. This is, next. I won't talk about this because I think Mr. Devare, Ambassador Devare gave a much more detailed history of the Russian-Ukraine history. So next. Once again, this has been talked about also in detail in the last session, so I won't go into that either. Next. So this is what is very striking, that food prices were going up in any case before the war, but this has really now exploded. And the share of Russia and Ukraine in world exports of wheat and barley have been very, very high, and in a particular edible oil, that is sunflower oil, is Ukraine, that's 65% of total sunflower exports in the world. And many countries in Europe, Middle East, Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa rely heavily on wheat from Russia and Ukraine, particularly Ukraine. Luckily, because of our own policies going back to the 1970s, to the Green Revolution, after the food crisis we had in the 1960s, we are not in that situation, but of course we do. The food price impact, the increase in food prices, of course, does affect us. And again, the contribution from Ukraine in particular to the World Food Program is also very high, and that obviously affects the very poor countries in Africa where the World Food Program provides food grains. And this, so the kind of actions that are going on, to which one doesn't see any end in Ukraine, these disruptions of supply of food will indeed continue. And even though there has been some kind of brokered settlement to allow food grain exports from Ukraine, it's still not really happening. And this again, the last point is the fertilizer. So again, that's a very important input to, that does affect us in terms of the prices of fertilizer and the availability of fertilizer. Next. This just gives the percentage share of global exports of number of items of Ukraine, which gives a sense of the kind of dislocation that is happening for the global economy. Next. So here you see the real spiking of energy prices, both crude oil and particularly natural gas. And the biggest sufferer from this, of course, is going to be Europe, because US hardly imports any natural gas. And the kind of change, spike that has already taken place, before much more cutting off of Russian natural gas to Europe, you can just imagine the kind of impact with this kind of huge 5 times increase in prices. So here again you see the huge importance of Russia and the UK in just supply of power, and the Russian oil exports. Here is the Russian oil exports revenue. Now, one of the interesting things is that despite the huge sanctions, Russian oil exports haven't suffered much yet. And that's partly because other countries like ourselves have taken up, have really increased our imports from oil imports from Russia, China, India, and others. The other point is that there's a whole history of a bunch of commodity traders, basically mainly based in, they operate out of Switzerland, and a small town called Zug, who are experts at beating sanctions. They've been doing this for forever, like 50, 60 years. And whenever there are sanctions against any country, whenever there are kind of some kind of dislocations, they go into action, and that's when they make money, because usually the price, so that Russia will sell them at a lower price, and then they will evade the sanctions, and the oil will get supplied, and also other commodities as well. So I think that some of the impact of the sanctions will be softened by some of these commodity traders. And for Russia, it's important because apart from oil, they're also big exporters of other commodities of different kinds of metals. Next. Here you can see the intensity of dependence of Europe to Russian gas, which is really just basically expanding on the point that I'm making all the time in terms of the impact, particularly in energy, particularly on Europe. And so that Europe is really the biggest sufferer outside Ukraine of this war, and the output losses that they will suffer overall. Next. Russia experienced sanctions in 2014 after the Crimea War. Japan has indeed now stopped importing oil from Russia. But the kind of impact on Europe, and I'm surprised that the last panel didn't talk much on, in a sense, on a geopolitical or domestic political impact of what's going to happen in Europe as the winter comes and this energy gas shortage becomes really severe, and you saw the prices, so that lots of people will indeed suffer from, and what will be then the domestic impact in Europe, and particularly the countries that are more affected. France is probably less affected because they have heavy dependence on nuclear. But what will happen in terms of public opinion for the sanctions and the war itself? The other point that was mentioned in the last panel is that after having denuclearized, there will be much more pressure to go back into fossil fuels, at least temporarily, and temporary could be medium term, with huge impact on whole climate change activity across the world. Inflation, of course, will also be much more persistent. Next. So, how much is Russia getting hurt? There was some comments on that in the last panel. So, in 1992, Russia suffered a lot immediately after the breakup of the Soviet Union, somewhat less so after the financial crisis. And in 22, it's expected to contract also significantly, but less than it did when the Soviet Union broke up. So inflation, of course, is very high as well. It's not very clear what the numbers are, but I guess it's not so much imported inflation there. One of the very interesting things is that the ruble went down very fast when the war started and the sanctions were put in. But they fully recovered, actually. The ruble is slightly higher, actually, than the pre-war levels. But that may be because of imports coming down more than exports coming down. And imports coming down is really a sign of a major economic slowdown. So the exchange rate may have recovered because the current account deficit is much lower. But it's lower not because exports have gone up, but because imports have gone down much more than exports. As I say here, the trade surplus is really much more a sign of weakness because it's telling you that the imports have come down because of all the sanctions and must be having a great impact on the domestic economy in Russia. Next. The impact on Ukraine, I think, is, at least onlookers without knowing much of Ukraine, only depending on some narratives and also television, that the human impact must be absolutely tremendous. That out of 44 million people, something between 7 to 9 million people have actually fled out of Ukraine. And we still haven't seen the kind of impact that has had on the rest of Europe where they have fled to. In addition to the 7 to 9 million who've gone out of Ukraine, there are about as many people who've been displaced from their homes. So that's something like more than a quarter of the population, more than a third of the population actually, which has got displaced. And just imagine that the kind of consequences people are feeling, and the economic consequences, not in just the short term, but the medium term, possibly long term. There must be a huge education crisis, again, which have a long-term impact. There must be a huge health crisis as well, because people are not getting access to medicines, hospital care, etc. So that's something one can't estimate, one can't imagine, but it must be absolutely huge. And of course, there's been massive destruction of physical capital. And one of the consequences which would concern the rest of the world, is that if the kind of estimate given by President Zelensky is there'll be about 70 billion needed to rebuild the country. Now, even if you take that as an exaggeration, which he would do, but nonetheless, it'll be huge. Even if you halve it to 350 or 400 billion. There will be a lot of pressure for the West to actually come up with those kind of resources. What will that mean to the rest of the world, much poorer world, in terms of resources going for development in the future? And this could be a medium-term issue because Ukraine won't be rebuilt in a day. I think we have not yet even started estimating, understanding both the physical, so all three, physical, human, economic loss that Ukraine has suffered. And here I think that even if it happens that Russia actually overruns Ukraine, what will they find? What will they do? And if they do, they certainly won't get Western aid to rebuild. And that itself will be a huge problem for Russia. And of course, if they don't, then again, the problem will remain. Next. So I don't talk much about India. The one consequence, of course, is the overall rise in in oil prices, and that's going to lead to current account deficit, a higher current account deficit, which will lead to exchange rate depreciation, and which at a certain level might be good for us. But if the RBI doesn't intervene excessively, but yes, that will be an impact. The most important thing is that it will probably result in lower growth than we should have, higher inflation, and if the higher inflation, as it probably will, lead to tighter monetary policy, then the growth slowdown will be more, and it might be medium term rather than immediately short term. And this is where one of the key points in the last session came right at the end, that the main issue before us, to my mind, in terms of our geopolitical standing, we have to keep reminding ourselves that our GDP is 1/5 of China. And because the populations are about the same, therefore GDP per capita is 1/5 of China. And so whatever else we may say, geopolitically, diplomatically, etc., unless we really grow much faster than we have in the last 10 years, we're not going to have the kind of standing in the world as has been talked about. And of course, we are in a dangerous geography in that the Chinese troops are at our borders, huge problems taking place in our neighboring countries, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal. Luckily, Bangladesh is relatively okay. This is going to be a huge issue. Very importantly, and this goes to some of the comments to the globalization, I'm sorry to inform people who think that globalization has come down. Globalization is alive and well. If you just look at trade volumes, trade in terms of proportion of GDP, but globalization is happily alive and well. And so the idea that we can do better by greater domestic production is just false. I'm saying it very strongly. And no country that has grown fast, these are particularly Asian countries, whether it's a huge country like China or a small country like Singapore, that no country has grown fast without high export growth. And we grew fast in the 2000s for almost 10 years, when our export growth rate was actually higher than the Chinese export growth rate. So the Russian-Ukraine conflict plus all the geopolitical, economic sanctions, dislocations, etc., will lead to merchandise trade volume coming down. And even if we have our own house in order in terms of exports, it will lead to a lower export growth and therefore lower import growth, lower economic growth. Next, I'm coming to the end, so don't worry. So global impact. the different the different kind of issues actually. I'm borrowing some of the comments that Martin Wolf made at a webinar that we had at CSEC. There are a lot of uncertainties. Obviously, the first one is how long will the war continue? How long will the Europeans and NATO stick together in light of the kind of comments I was making earlier in terms of the economic impact on Europe? If the war ceases, will it be through exhaustion on both sides or agreed ceasefire? How and when will the Black Sea be reopened for trade, which is important for both Russia and Ukraine and for the rest of the world? How will Ukraine get rebuilt? If, as and when and if the war ends, how long will sanctions continue? And the impact on overall global economic arrangements. In a sense, even more seriously, I think you can shut down the PowerPoint now. In terms of longer term uncertainties, I think we do need to just reflect back, and this is to do with globalization, that the last era of globalization was in the late 19th century, from 1870 to the First World War. And there was a huge disruption. And then it took 2 world wars for the world to come back to much more international cooperation. And so the question is that will something like this happen? And this again on the issue of globalization. Is this in some sense a hinge moment in world history in which the division of the world between competing blocs is cemented, some of the kind of issue that I talked about in the last session? And what was also then talked about India, what does that imply for countries like ours, which are in neither bloc? Also, of course, for the integration of the world economy as a whole, and for strategic relations, as was talked about in the last session. So, I'll conclude saying, look, the war, I think among the things we can be relatively confident about is certainly the war will damage Ukraine almost permanently, and Russia. The unification of the West between Europe and the US will perhaps be temporary. Huge dilemma for China, and as was said in the last session, they've been very careful, but the future we don't know. And as also said in the last session, that this kind of the war is probably, at least for a period of time, marks a decisive end to an era in which economics was the focus of great power relations to geopolitical relationships. And I'll just, last point is that this is even prior to the war, that with the, I've often said that the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting from the mid-Atlantic to the Indian Ocean after 200 years. This has nothing to do with the Russia-Ukraine war. And the West doesn't like it, of course. And they're going to resist it like mad. And we are sort of somewhere in between. And we have to, so all the issues that were mentioned in the last session are very important on how we conduct ourselves in the future with this kind of huge change taking place in global power relations dominated by the economic power being shifting to the east. In my view, we have made a major error in withdrawing from RCEP because the global economic growth is going to be the east of us, not to the west of us, and we will count ourselves out from that. The China issue is a real issue for us, but the way I think about it is, look, the country that is the most threatened by China is Taiwan, and that doesn't make any difference to them in terms of the economic and trade and investment relations with China. So we should learn from that, while of course we have to, there's no question that we have to strengthen ourselves and resolve in terms of the disputes that we have with China. Thank you. I don't know if I kept it 20 minutes or not, but...
Well, I stopped counting, so it's okay. So, thank you very much for that very broad stroke understanding, brings all of us onto the same page in this conversation. So next we have a double engine presentation. with Ila Patnaik and Ajay have put it together, and Ajay has been appointed as the presenter and the spokesperson for this.
So originally Ila was going to come here in person. Once that was flipped into video, she said no, it makes no sense to do something by video. So we've pooled our work, and I'm doing this as a joint talk. Yeah, this is 2 versus 1. Dr. Rakesh Mohan has been the boss to both Ila and me in life before, so he understands exactly all the things that we think can do. Okay, so I'm going to organize this around some 5 big questions. The first is, let's start at some thinking about the global energy business. Okay, so Russia is of course an oil and gas giant and also an important coal exporter. There is a natural resources dimension in some other fields like alumina as well. Both Russia and Ukraine are important in the export of wheat. Pranay will know more about this. Ukraine has become surprisingly important in the global value chain in semiconductors. So we don't tend to think of this, but it's something to keep in mind that in the global, in the complex globalized production of semiconductors, Ukraine is unusually important. Now let's think about the relationship between Russia and Europe. There's been a huge debate in Germany about the lack of wisdom in Germany in the last 30 years in building up an energy dependence on Russia. As Rakesh was just saying, that there was a world of globalization where many of us thought that you could put great power politics aside and you could just get on with business. And that was a mood in Germany. There was almost a civilizing concept that if we trade more with Russia, we will help Russia become a more civilized country, and they will become a more democratic country. The authoritarian stuff will go down. So there was a lot of optimism in Germany. Today it has turned into a choke point. Nord Stream 1 is an important pipeline where the supply is down by 80%. At first it was cut by 60%, now it has been cut by 80%. And Russia would like to do everything it can to choke Europe on energy supply as a way to get leverage on the question in Ukraine. I just want to parenthetically say to many of the geostrategy people here that there are of course connections between the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 because it was about grabbing pipelines. So if you look at the land area in Georgia that was grabbed in 2008, it controls some of the pipelines. So pipelines are key to this, and as the output from Azerbaijan finds its way directly to Europe without going through Russia, there is a greater chance of hostilities coming up around Azerbaijan as well. Because for Putin, it is critical to have that choke point of controlling European energy consumption. Now, these things tend to work in the short term, they have tactical value, and they tend to go badly in the long run. Nobody likes being extorted, and so the enormous intellectual, financial, technological and state capacity of Europe is now being devoted to solving these problems. So it's like China and rare earths, that these things seem really scary in the short term, but nobody likes to be extorted. That is not the way business and economic relationships are built. Can you imagine what would happen if India announced to the United States that all the call center workers in JP Morgan will refuse to work for JP Morgan tomorrow? Yes, in the short term it would be a dislocation. On any kind of strategic scale, it would be the biggest blunder that India could possibly commit. So there is a host of responses that is afoot. Europe is buying a lot more LNG and building LNG facilities at an unheard of rate. In the olden days, we were told that building an LNG facility takes 2 to 4 years. There are some floating facilities that are going to be in place in Germany by the end of this year before the winter comes in. Then they've initiated conservation measures, just push down all the temperatures in heating. They are really burning up effort on putting up renewables. And I think it has an interesting strategic link because in a way, the fossil fuels under the ground in Russia had a finite sell-by date because the world was going to go to a renewables world anyway. And in that finite set of years, Russia has damaged its ability to sell fossil fuel. They will get reduced realizations from this. So it's a very interesting moment, and you've got to see the distinction between Putin's age and time horizon versus what is in the best interests of the Russian economy. Finally, Russian oil and gas exploration and extraction requires Western technology and management. the capabilities inside Russia do not exist to keep the fields going, and so that will also have an adverse impact on the medium term. So in the short term, some fields will continue to work, but the sanctions are damaging the ability of Russia to continue to explore and extract oil and gas. So this is the picture on energy. Next, I turn to sanctions. Many of us tend to think that until 1989, the USSR lived in a world of complete autarky. So they've been there, done that. They know how to do autarky, and they'll just go back to autarky. And I think this is an incorrect reading, because from 1989 to 2022, Russia deeply integrated into the world economy. And it is a very different thing to be told all of a sudden that we're going to pull the plug on globalization. It's a different thing to say that from 1917 and the Civil War, you built up an autarkic framework. So you're doing self-reliance, you make all kinds of low quality equipment, but you figured out a complex domestic ecosystem of production where everything is done domestically. But that's not how the Russian economy works today. And there are numerous production points in Russia which are integrated into globalization through finance, through management, through technology, through imported parts. And for any country to have this experience of a sudden pulling the plug on globalization is pretty catastrophic. So I feel that the damage on the Russian economy is very high, and we're only beginning to see how this will pan out. As an example, I talked about oil and gas already. That in the short term, it appears that you can keep the fields working. In the medium term, it is not possible, because they do not have the parts, they do not have the engineers, there is no Schlumberger in Russia, and the management of the large Russian oil and gas companies was greatly driven and shaped by Western oil and gas companies. So I think that the sudden deglobalization is a very costly thing, and it's not been adequately appreciated. Side by side with this, there have been very large losses to Russian and Western private persons, because suddenly pulling the plug is very costly, and it disrupts business, and many large losses have been experienced. I just want to parenthetically talk about ruble stability. Some people think that because the ruble is stable, things are relatively okay. This is not correct. The ruble has gone down from being a hard currency to being a capital controls currency. So they've sort of dropped from being a hard currency to being like the Indian rupee. It's a much less enticing environment for a local person, where you are now being told there are these 45 capital controls on what you can do. And second, as Paul Krugman emphasized, and that was mentioned in Rakesh's slideshow, the real glory of globalization lies not in being able to export, but in being able to import. That once you get that hard currency, you can buy raw materials and devices and widgets and services from the whole world. And Russia apparently has a trade surplus today because of sanctions which block the ability of others to sell things to Russia. So superficially it looks fine. There's a very high oil and gas revenue. And so Russia has the US dollars, but they're not able to buy stuff. So that sounds like a nice place to be, but it's actually a very bad place to be, because you just can't buy things from the world economy. That's a very costly place. So there was a discussion, when will Putin sue for peace? And yes, the military conditions on the battlefield will matter, but I think a very big issue, as Rakesh said, is a question of the sanctions. The really big bargaining chip on the negotiation is about putting an end to the war, about what will happen to land, who will get to control what land, and how will the sanctions regime unwind. So the West is very much on the negotiating table, and it's not purely about a military situation in Ukraine. Okay, third, I turn to global macro. The war came in a context of a difficult environment in global macro. It was the context of the pandemic, of high inflation, of disrupted and slowly healing supply chain, and of a European debt crisis. So these were the four problems that were there. And the war complicates this. So it makes things more difficult in terms of the global inflation fight. And really the biggest pain is in Europe. In Europe today, we have the problems of the energy saber rattling, where Nord Stream 1 has gone down by 80%. There is a surge in the prices of energy. There is an uncertainty shock, because there's a whole bunch of unknowns about the future that will adversely affect investment. And when the ECB tries to get inflation under control. They have to deal with the problem of debt fragility in Europe, most notably Italy. Italy is really teetering. Small increases in interest rates and small deterioration in GDP growth puts Italy on a path to debt instability, and this is a very big problem in Europe. So there's a real economic problem in Europe as a consequence of this war. Again, I want to echo what Rakesh said. The destruction in Ukraine is an important damage to global capital stock. So some 500 billion, $1 trillion of buildings, bridges, railway stations. So, the Russian army doesn't have precision guided equipment, and they seem to be indiscriminately throwing World War II style artillery into the problem, and that causes a lot of damage. So global capital stock has taken a beating of somewhere between $500 billion to $1 trillion, and that is a cost to global GDP because there's a productive capacity of the flow of goods and services that is coming out from all that. I just want to take a side note on a debate that one sees sometimes. It's about defense expenditure. Some people say that the surge in global defense expenditure is a significant issue for the global economy. That's not correct. The numbers involved are really small. So if you think of pre-war conditions, there is just a vast asymmetry. Russian military spending was about $60 billion. Western military spending was about $1 trillion. So, Russia will push it up from $60 billion to $90 billion. They're tiny sums of money for the West. So military spending is not the issue, but the destruction of capital stock is an issue. Okay, fourth, I turn to the economic outlook on a global scale, and then I finally will come to implications for India. What is happening in the world is that I think that there was a lot of gloom through the morning, and if we can just look beyond 1 or 2 years, it's actually not that bad. So I think that there is an expansion of Europe in terms of economics and political integration. So, if you ever thought that Poland was wavering, I think that's over. Poland is firmly back in the Western camp into the European Union. Even Hungary is reevaluating, do I really want to be a nationalist country? So I think that there's a clear expansion of Europe and NATO. There is stability in the economic arrangements in Europe. And so I think once we get past the war and we get past the European energy transition, I think Europe will come back as a powerful economic center, and that will be good for the world economy. The Russian military has taken such a beating that I think for 5, 10, 20 years, there will be a low threat on the eastern side. So Eastern Europe will really blossom as compared to the kind of constant security threat that was there after Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014. I think that Eastern Europe will really take off. There was a comment made that restraints on the use of force have diminished in the world. Perhaps I see things differently. I think that the message to the world is don't invade your neighbor. So it's very, very costly for Russia to invade a neighbor, and I think many other prospective invaders will be more careful looking forward. So I feel relatively optimistic about economic stability once you get past this crisis. That whether you think about Europe, the expansion of NATO, the expansion of the European Union, the prosperity in Eastern Europe, and the incentive structure for a next invader, such as China, I think the world will become a safer place. But I do agree with what Rakesh was saying about rethinking globalization. There is a change happening in front of our eyes in the nature of globalization. And I want to link back to something that Gautam Bambawale really emphasized when we were working on the book on China. What the Chinese side used to emphasize was the idea that, look, we'll fight some wars on the border, but nobody should interfere with economic, business, and financial integration. And the Indian side drew a red line saying no, that economic, financial, and business integration is predicated on good behavior on questions of military and foreign policy. That you've got to be calm and kind and careful and not fight wars, not invade your neighbor. Then after that, all the good things of globalization can flow. And I think that's the kind of world that we will see, and we will scale back from the idea that look, you could just keep on doing business and it will have a civilizing influence. Sort of like the way the German policymakers chose to integrate with Russia, that let's just give it time. The way the American policymakers were optimistic about China, like look, just give it time, everybody's going to become a nice democracy. It's not happening, and I think that there will be a deeper change in the architecture of globalization around these problems. Now, we should think more about global firms. Most global economic activity is shaped by about 5,000 important firms. These firms have taken large losses in Russia and in China. And again, if you think of their boards, earlier the boards of firms were very comfortable, saying, look, it can be some thuggish authoritarian country, it's okay, just go ahead, invest, build a business. Over time, all countries will get fixed. There was sort of an end of history view on the part of global corporations. The losses that have taken place in Russia and China are going to make a lot of people more circumspect that, really? Is this the country that we're going into? And think more about foreign policy. Think more about political stability. The freedom in the world ranking of free, partly free, and not free, will start becoming more important in how we think about these things. And so there was a really remarkable Janet Yellen speech. Gautam and I were planning that we should organize a meeting just to understand the paragraphs of that speech. Exactly as Rakesh said, it's a turning point in the history of globalization. Never before has an important first world policymaker so clearly put down this kind of conditionality, that there is a G1, there is a globalization in the world where there are certain concepts of democracy, foreign policy, and military affairs that are a precondition. So it's exactly like the Indian position around China, that first you behave on the border, then we will discuss economic matters. So finally, coming to implications for India, as was emphasized by Nitin and Rakesh, India has a very low economic integration with Russia. India is primarily economically integrated into the West. If you think of the prosperity of Pune, the bulk of the outward orientation has been into Western countries. So our stake lies in deepening our economic ties with the West. And we should recognize that there will be more home bias by global companies in the context of these losses that have been experienced in Russia and China, and the vulnerabilities that have been understood in the economic system when you are faced with more nationalistic and more authoritarian countries. So we should think more about how India will navigate in this landscape, that there is a more limited globalization between countries that are democracies, that play by the rules of the game, that will not yank call center workers for JP Morgan, and that will become a full part of globalization. There are gains to India in this process from a certain retreat by global companies vis-a-vis China. So I think that is one piece that is really going well for India, and India is being seen as a gainer from the smaller share of China in the global supply chain. This raises three questions for us. The first is that there are many, many long-standing difficulties in the Indian economy. All of you in this room know that Vijay Kelkar and I wrote a book about this, that it is very difficult to build firms, to build sophisticated organizations in the Indian institutional landscape. And so while we will welcome more global companies taking interest in India, India is a famously bad environment for global companies to operate in. And we in India need to focus on our knitting and build better institutional frameworks so that there is a greater predictability and rule of law as seen by global companies. And we need to think more about the foreign policy and military aspects about what is India's path in this emerging globalization. Thank you.
Thanks, Ajay. I'll just, since we have a couple of minutes, I just want to tie a couple of things from these two presentations into what it means for us. And then I'll invite questions, because there's enough talent in this, on this side of the house, which can sort of overpower the talent on this side of the house. So, but let me just make two quick points. It was at the Symbiosis School of International Relations. I was giving a lecture almost 10 years ago to undergrads, and in the last 2 minutes there were like 10 questions, And the 10 questions from the undergrads were like, sir, what should be our policy towards China? What should be our policy towards United States? What should be our policy towards Pakistan? What should be so there's a half dozen countries which was a set, and I had like 30 seconds to answer. And I had to stand up and answer in front of undergrads. You have to show that you're an intelligent person. So I said our foreign policy should be 8% growth. Our foreign policy towards China policy is 8% growth, our US policy is 8% growth, our Pakistan policy is 8%. Whichever country you take, our policy is 8% growth. And later I had a conversation with Vijay Kelkar, and he liked this very much. And he said, this is instinctively making sense. Right? So I think the underlying story here is that we have to, whatever happens in Ukraine, our overall policy should be to get back to 8% growth. And as it came out in this presentation, it won't come by navel gazing or trying to dig out gold from our backyards and making our engineers work harder and all of that. It comes with an engagement with the world. It comes with imports, it comes with exports. So, an out-of-the-box idea, I think if you have to take this or take away from this, is really that I think India has the need, and it is in India's national interest to be the new champion of globalization. To be a new champion of multilateralism, World Trade Organization, etc. Especially because the mood in the world is that, what World Trade Organization, that story is over, that multilateral story is over. That's very nice to hear, but that's not what we want. For our prosperity, we need to have a multilateral trading system where we can get back into a high export and high growth path. Okay, so that's just one thought I would want to give. And just the point is that this is not necessarily on the ground an alternative to Atmanirbhar and self-reliance and so on. You can do self-reliance, you must invest in self-reliance, you must build self-reliant capacity. But at the same time, you can pursue international trade, and you can pursue international trade in two ways. You can do, the fresh breath which we have seen in the last 6 months is the Indian Commerce Ministry going out and trying to build preferential trade arrangements, FTAs with other countries, which is a great first step. But you could also do it multilaterally. In the sense, our answer therefore is all of the above. We must do Atmanirbhar, we must do multilateral, we must do bilateral. All and every single mechanism that we have to improve growth should be taken. And that seems to be the thing, not to be doctrinaire about this. You don't have to be in favor of multilateralism or Atmanirbhar, you do all of the above. So that's number one. The second is, I think Dr. Mashelkar started this in the morning. And it came out through both the presentations. I don't know whether you got it enough or not, so I just want to re-emphasize this. Nuclear is part of the answer. In fact, the word nuclear is written large over the whole Ukraine crisis. First, in terms of nuclear weapons, if you don't have nuclear weapons, bad things will happen to you and nobody can save you. That's the lesson from Ukraine. Right? If you hadn't given up your nuclear weapons, would you have been in such a situation? No, obviously not. Right? So it's like children, please develop nuclear weapons is one kind of a lesson. The second is nuclear energy. Very few people realize that Europe finds itself in this situation because in 2010 they just turned off nuclear. Something happened in Fukushima and they said, oh my God, nuclear is so dangerous, and they start turning things off. All of a sudden, and it's not like one or two, it's the whole system goes off nuclear. And does anybody know how many people died in Japan because of the nuclear radiation after Fukushima? 0. That one person is actually controversial, he's like claiming that. But 0 people died. They died in the flood and the flooding and all of that. But the worst nuclear accident in recent times after Chernobyl, nobody died. And they turned off nuclear reactors across. And now we have to see winter is coming, what do we do? And second, I think also which was pointed out was, buying gas. You could have bought gas through liquefied natural gas. Instead of that, Europe bought gas through pipelines. At least India was sensible in the 2000s not to go for the IPI pipeline which was being talked about. Instead of that, we went in for LNG, which was a smart solution. Europe did not. Now, be that as it may, I think the lesson for India in terms of nuclear is that we now need urgently a governance framework to rebuild our nuclear power industry. I think by around 2010, we decided to box ourselves in, we've locked ourselves into a cupboard and we've thrown the key away in terms of nuclear. So other than government, there's very little room for a private investor to invest in nuclear. at a time in which private nuclear industry is taking off around the world in terms of small reactors, next generation reactors. So I think we need a governance framework to bring nuclear back as an important source of energy for India. And for India, again, just like growth, energy is also the story. All of the above is the answer. We need more nuclear, we need more coal, we need more renewables, we need more of everything. Right? And nuclear also tends to be a more environmentally friendly option. And although a lot of people intuitively feel that it's something non-green, but it is actually quite green. So on that note, let me invite you to ask questions, quick and sharp questions. And we'll do comments later if we have time, but let's use this first round for questions. Administrator.
No difficult question. To the panel, I mean, today we've heard from you issues of the impact of sanctions on Russia and how they cut in multiple complex ways. And that's fair enough, it was brought out in good detail. In the case of a Chinese, possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, what might be, the type of sanctions that might punish China, and how much of that proportion of punishment be on the people who impose sanctions and countries like us who may not have a role to play and yet will have an impact from the sanctions. And related to that, what might China do to blunt the impact of these sanctions and impose other types of sanctions that might hurt?
In 2014, when the sanctions came, Putin launched a very big program to sanction-proof the Russian economy and particularly to sanction-proof the military. We know it did not work too well because it's hard. Now, a large-scale sanctions regime against China is a very different kettle of fish. China is so deeply integrated into the world economy, and China is a big economy. Russia is basically a small country. It's a Spain-sized GDP. So it's very easy for the West to brush aside Russia. China is a different kettle of fish. So it would be unlikely for the West to take on a high level of pain in sanctioning China, because China is so deeply integrated into the world economy that the other side will become more cautious. So of course there will be attempts at finding points of pain, and for example, Rakesh and I would have considered it unthinkable that central bank reserves would be touched, but they were. And China is a big holder of central bank reserves. So there is a lot of pain that can be inflicted. But in my opinion, can the Russian-style comprehensive sanctions regime be done by the West against China? I would consider it unlikely. That said, they can make it very, very, very unpleasant for China. So it would exert deterrence for China when they think of future invading your neighbor things, which is also good for India, because we've got to play this to the hilt that there is a very high restraint against the use of force in the modern international order, and we want to stand up to the world and say, look, we should be protected when somebody tries to use force against us. Of course the Chinese are studying this. The Chinese have been great students of the collapse of the USSR. They've done everything they can to try to make sure that their country goes down this line differently. So it's a moving landscape, and we'll see how it goes.
I'll just make two brief comments on this. One, that just to remind ourselves that prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, you sort of had two non-intersecting economic systems. So there was very little trade between the Soviet system and the rest of the world. That has totally reversed now, 30 years of globalization, so that the economy is extremely intertwined, not just China, but all economies extremely intertwined. So that's just putting a little more force to what Ajay was saying. But the other point I would say is that the issue that China is so intertwined that it will be very difficult to put sanctions, therefore moves the other way around also, actually, in terms of the possibility of China taking action against other countries, that if they know that, look, people can't sanction us, they're actually freer to do it. So it could go either way, as far as I can understand.
So Ambassador Verma first, and then. No, I think I'm just taking it in the turn. I mean, I saw you first, so.
Yeah. Thank you, and excellent presentations today. You know, very reassuring. And I hope you're right. Because this is precisely the sort of thinking that led to building up deterrence against Russia, and it failed. The point I'm making is not that your argument is flawed. In fact, your argument is perfect. The imperfection comes in governments around the world because of rising insecurity to take economically irrational decisions. Russia's invasion they knew that $600 billion hanging around the world was not going to protect them. The Sapsan fast train from Moscow to St. Petersburg will stop running in December because Siemens is going to pull out. They knew all that. But countries take pain. You see, I'm repeating this again. In the last 30 years, countries would have followed your prescription. Make a cost analysis. And the costs are very high of being a rebel in this international system. Very high. And still are very high. My point is that it is no longer having the deterrent effect that it has. The Chinese have scared off the Americans, and Nancy Pelosi is almost not going to Taiwan. Almost not going. We will. The Serbians are trying to attack Kosovo last night. The Turks are about to take over northern Syria. So there is a lot of lawlessness in the world. And the lawlessness in the world is exacerbated by the economic instability in the peripheries. And there are a lot of periphery. Look at South Asia. Which country in our neighborhood is stable? Ripe for intervention, infiltration by foreign forces. So I would agree with your analysis. I hope you're right, but I think it's a little too optimistic.
I'll just add on to that. I think you brought out a very important point in the sense that, very often I say this to people, I hope you're right, I fear I am, right? In the sense that I hope you're right, but I fear he is, right? So, and the point that he made, and I think Raja Mohan made again in the morning, is about stupidity. In the sense that there's a very interesting book called The Laws of Stupidity by a guy called Kipola. And it defines stupidity as an action which harms you and harms everybody else also. It's like a lose-lose for everyone. So, and there's no insurance against stupidity, right? In addition to the things which he mentioned, one was, and I think he mentioned it earlier also, the weaponization of interdependence by the West. So suddenly, by creating a condition where the foreign tech companies follow Washington's lead. So Washington doesn't like Moscow, so tech company X doesn't like Moscow and is going to switch off the lights in Moscow. Now, as a person sitting in India, I have an iPhone and I'm wondering if the relationship between Washington and New Delhi deteriorates to a certain level. What if Apple turns off my iPhone? My traffic is on iPhone, I can't use because it's all login and so on. So that has also been harmful, right? So that's also in a way stupid. So in a world where this kind of, let's call it, for the want of a more accurate word, let's call it stupid. Where stupid decisions are being taken. How does this play out? Does your optimism bear out in this world? And I think we'll ask you first, and then we'll ask Dr. Rakesh.
I think we are too ready to write off Putin as an irrational actor. Okay, so you know him better than me. So can I just play an argument? And we would love to hear your thoughts on whether that's a reasonable position. Okay, now, Little Green Men worked in 2014. Okay, nobody resisted. You cracked Crimea. Okay, great success. Then after that, Putin felt that America is on the decline. America used to be a great democracy, and it has become nationalistic, right-wing, Trump, incompetent. And after that, the retreat from Afghanistan was botched. And the Germans are ready to cozy up, and there is gas dependence. So you could be a rational actor in the Kremlin, in early 2022 and say, let's roll the dice. Daring paratrooper take over at Hostomel Airport, get some armor in, lightning fast, ride into Kiev and shoot Zelensky, okay? And it would have gone down in history as a remarkable and successful raid, like 2014 Crimea was. You could make that rational argument. So hindsight is always 20/20. In hindsight, it looks like this was a complete disaster. But ex ante, there was a sufficient mess in the global system, and not least the rise of Donald Trump. Donald Trump's America is not the old America. It's a very different landscape. And then suddenly you think Donald Trump wants to get America out of NATO. The West is fractured. The social media campaign of Putin was able to get UK closer to Brexit. So Putin felt that he had a winning hand of cards. In hindsight, it appears obvious that he did not. So it sounds like stupidity with hindsight. But many a brilliant military raid is done under improbable conditions where a simple force calculation is not justifying the raid, but you think that the Hebrew word chutzpah, the sheer chutzpah is going to carry you through, and sometimes it does in world history and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm not yet ready to write off Putin as an irrational actor.
I don't really have too much to say on this because I don't have any insight into Mr. Putin's mind. But I would say that in terms of stupidity, look, the Americans were in Afghanistan for 20 years. 20 years of stupidity, not 6 months, not 2 months, 20 years. They've destroyed Iraq when there were no weapons of mass destruction. And the story can go on. So I think that there's no limit to stupidity, and I'm sort of under the handicap that because I was on long flights a month ago or so, that I picked up the most latest book by Ken Follett called Never. It's very nice because it's 700 pages long, so it takes you on. The reason I'm mentioning this is that it takes you through. Starting with a small incident in Chad. This is a novel in Chad. And it gets escalated. The book ends with nuclear war between China and the US, and therefore the end of the world in a sense. So obviously that's a novel, but the point is that small things can keep escalating in a stupid fashion. And in that particular novel, North Korea is involved, China is involved, Japan is involved, Chad is involved. But this thing starts by some North Koreans in Chad doing something, and US retaliates, and then China retaliates, and so on. So I'm just mentioning that purely from it's a total fiction, but I would say that's a high likelihood of very bad things happening. But I think we have to be more conscious of those things possibly happen, and applying our minds to how for them not to happen.
Nitin, you rightly said that the best foreign policy for India is 8% GDP growth per annum. Could I ask the economists and the electrical engineers on the podium to give us two big ideas or two macro ideas which will ensure that India grows at 8% GDP growth per annum over the next 10 years?
Actually, I can't give you two big ideas, but what I can do is to send you a long paper. which provides actually a strategy for high long-term growth. But I will say a few things. One, that a follow-up to that long paper, I've talked about the need for third generation economic reforms. So people ask me, what are the first generation, what is the second generation, what do you mean by the third generation? So I said the first generation was the economic policy adopted immediately after independence. And was that you call the economic policy? Of course, it was a huge economic policy reforms. took us from zero growth from over 100 years to 3.5% growth for the next 30 years. And the foundations of so many of our economic institutions, etc., were put in place in the first 15 years. So there is huge economic reforms actually took place. Second, of course, was post-1990s. The third thing that I'm saying, and this is sort of, maybe you can say a big idea, but I don't know how to accomplish it, that one can characterize the 1990s reforms as taking business, so taking government out of the hair of business, and therefore allowing the private sector to perform as best as it can, through the abilities that it can, and capacity that it has. What we have not done is a similar way to empower the public sector. I don't mean public sector companies, I mean public sector in terms of all government, different levels, regulatory authorities, etc. We have not empowered the public sector, defined that way, to be competent. Also, this also comes as news to people, this work actually done by Devesh Kapoor and others, that actually Indian government is very small. So both in terms of quality and quantity, there has to be expansion. Expansion, again, not to do things that the government should not do, but to do things the government should do. For example, we are probably the most privatized country in health and education, more than the United States. And this is causing huge problems in terms of the amount of money people have to spend, probably also leading to corruption because people can't afford to get health and education unless they are corrupt. So the second point is, one thing that all governments have failed for 75 years is giving emphasis to health and education for all. So that's the second thing, and that can be done, in my view. Third is really giving putting 8% growth as the key objective, which I don't see today, and everything else following from that. There has to be some rearrangement in the sense that, yes, we've abolished the Climate Commission because we didn't like that style, but to my knowledge, no country has grown at 8% growth rate without a major national coordinating mechanism, whatever you would call it. And this is becoming more important with all the new issues of climate change and other kind of global issues coming up. That if you look at climate change, because that's something we are working on, it just cuts across technologies in private industry, technologies for energy, of course, power, technologies for renewables, and foreign policy will be involved here because I think Ajay made a slight mention of that in terms of the concentration of critical minerals. That is one thing when, say, 10% of energy is from renewables. It's another when 50% or 60% or 70% is renewables. Then the kind of demand for the critical minerals that go into battery storage, solar panels, etc., will really shoot up tremendously. Of course, more exploration is going to take place, but at present, these things are all concentrated. Some in China, some in Ukraine, some in Australia. So there's going to be a mad rush for critical minerals. So going a bit far over, my point is that we will not be able to grow at 8% growth unless we tackle climate change, and along with that, especially on how to substitute renewable energy for fossil fuels energy. I can go on, but I think but the key point I would say is that you need a much higher focus on how to do 8% growth. I may have my ideas, Nitin may have his ideas, Lata may have her ideas, you may have your ideas, but there has to be a much greater focus to get some consensus of the things to do, which we are not doing today.
Yeah, if I have to pull an answer, I think this is an answer which Narendra Modi as the prime ministerial candidate offered. That is to create 100 new cities. Now, this is important for many reasons, including climate and the Ukraine. Let's say we were to embark on that challenge tomorrow, the Ukraine crisis will have a big bearing on it because in terms of capital. The reason I talk about cities is because you need them as engines of growth. and the kind of, okay, let me give you a cricketing analogy. The required run rate in order to employ the demographics, which is turning out in this country, in the terms of young people turning 18 and coming into the job market, the required run rate is 20 million jobs per year. We need to be able to create 20 million jobs per year. The best current run rate, there are various estimates. Okay, you could go by the governments or by the critics or whatever. The best run rate is about 2 million jobs per year. So we are creating only 2 million jobs, and we had to start this in 5 years ago. So there is a huge surplus of people. So just like cricket, every year that the required run rate becomes higher and higher. So how do you create 20 million jobs a year? You have to create cities. That's when, all the way from construction to housing to health, education, everything starts coming out. And we have to start imaginatively thinking about how to create new cities. Right now, our only game seems to be renaming old cities. No? That's a very easy thing to do. But I think creating new cities and naming them after your favorite hero, I think is the biggest challenge out there, and that's the solution to a lot of our problems. We can name it after every hero or any hero that we want, but we have to create them first.
But the new city will have to be export oriented. For job generation, we only have about 12 or 13 million manufacturing jobs in the organized sector. China at its peak had about 120 million, but that's come down now. So one thing that I should have mentioned is really again a much greater focus on merchandise exports, plus of course service exports also. But the kind of employment we're talking about, it will not happen unless you have really a major thrust on labor-intensive manufacturing. Many people say, well, no, that bus has left. That's not true. Just think of the 3 billion people or 4 billion people in Asia. This is why I keep mentioning Asia. Except for Japan and Korea, they're still at income levels of around between $2,000 and $10,000 per capita. So they will keep growing for a long time, even if there's a demographic change. So if 3 billion people buy one shirt extra every year, a pair of shoes extra every year, a set of toys extra every year, everything that goes to the house when you build cities, so that bus has not left. We fool ourselves saying the bus has left, and that is something to concentrate on, so that cities can be generators of wealth only if they do that.
Yeah. In terms of health, education, tourism, etc. So Manipal as a city creates huge amount of wealth and jobs for that region. Anyway, so
don't want to belabor this. Gautam, as you know, Kelkar and I have a book on this subject. So, Rakesh, you merely wrote a paper, we wrote a book. And if there is one idea I would take out of that, basically what Rakesh said, look, we should focus on it. We should debate it. We need a whole intellectual push on understanding what went wrong. Why did high Indian growth stall in around 2011? And what is required to change it? So I think we need a community, we need a debate, we need to rethink the foundations. The foundations have broken.
Yeah, I think there are 2 online questions. They've been answered. There was a question about our economic growth story, and I got the message. We are talking about 115, so I'm just closing that up. So both the questions which were here online have been answered, so they can be satisfied. Although we didn't ask the questions. 115, and as I promised, no, I think we have to finish at 115.
One question.
If we can finish in 30 seconds Q&A. Yes,
sir, with your permission,
My question only made.
Chairman sir, with your permission, I am here.
No, I think we have to.
Sorry.
No, I think I will use my power as chairperson to end the session here. There are too many questions, and it won't be fair to pick one and avoid the other. So we can do these Q&As at lunch, and there are afternoon sessions, and there's a closing session. So you will still be able to ask those questions, get those answers, because we are not letting these guys run away without answering your questions. So please join us for lunch. It's 1:15. It's great to enter lunch 15 minutes late, but still early enough to satisfy our hunger. So thank you very much for being here.